Welcome to HortTube. My name is John Putnam. In this video, I'm going to be moving this gold foliage Weigela. It's planted in the back corner of my garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. It's been in the ground a little over a year. I planted this Japanese maple behind it, just a little whip, really. Grafted Japanese maple that I got from Mr. Maple. You can go back and look at the two videos I did with Matt and Tim on the channel if you'd like. Super interesting place, but I knew when I planted the Japanese maple here that this Weigela was going to have to move, and I just waited until it was completely dormant in the winter time. This is the best time to be doing this. If you're digging in your landscape, you're transplanting plants, you're new to the house, make sure you call and get all the lines located if you don't know where lines are located. All of my lines at this house are above ground. It's in an old neighborhood. All the lines, again, are above ground except for my cable line, and it's in the front yard. So I just kind of know where all of mine are, but know that before you start digging. Normally, okay, so if this plant had been in the ground for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, longer than it has been, I normally will root prune, and let me show you that real quick. I'm going to get the leaves away from this real quick so we can see the ground around it. Just clean it up. And I've got my hardwood mulch under that. We'll get rid of that in just a minute. But okay, so we can see the ground. We can see the ground now. Normally, if I'm going to move an older established plant, I would come around somewhere out in the drip line and I would actually cut the roots on it, but leave it in place. And I would have done this probably back in like November. And then I would have just left it in place. And it's just a root pruning technique that kind of allows the plant to reestablish itself into a smaller space, and then transplants much easier and much more willingly. But again, this one just hasn't been in the ground that long, so I don't need to do that. So what I'm gonna do is pull back the rest of my mulch, dig around about the same area that I was. We wanna get as much of this root ball as we possibly can. And then I've got a tarp here next to it. And what I try to do is not lift the plant way up into a wheelbarrow. It's better if you can, wherever it's going, barely lift it onto a tarp, and then we'll slide it. So a few reasons why this is the best time of year. Number one, obviously the plant is dormant. I'm here in early February doing this, so the plant's not trying to grow at the same time that I'm damaging its roots. The soil tends to be a little more moist this time of year, and it's easier to work. If it happens to be dry in your area and you're about to transplant a plant, you might want to water the area just a bit. One thing I will typically do when I transplant plants, especially if this one was more established, is I'd probably cut it back by about a third. I talk about this quite a bit. We're about to do a damage to probably about a third of the roots. This thing, no matter how hard I try, this thing's going to lose about a third of its roots, and that can be compensated for by pruning back about a third of the top. This super deciduous, very dormant Weigela that happens to bloom on old wood, meaning it's already got its flower buds on it, I'd prefer not to prune. So I'm going to avoid pruning this one. Don't think it's necessary. If this was an evergreen shrub, had all its leaves on it, I would definitely be reducing it to compensate for that root damage. Just don't think it's necessary. One other approach on these wider spreading plants like this is you can come in here and use a string and tie all of these up like this, and that will make it easier to dig around them. So that's a pretty good technique if you ever need to. This one's not spread out so much that I can't get under it, so I'm not going to worry about that either, but just want to point these things out that might make it easier for you. I'm going to just come out here. This was a 3-gallon plant, and so the root ball was initially about 12 inches wide. I'm going to try to get maybe 18 inches wide, something like that. And you can already see there's just not much to this. It just hasn't been in the ground long enough to really get itself fully anchored. My soil, as you can see, is greatly improved through the use of mulch, compost, and some wood chips that I've used out here. Let's see. So I've kind of cut the roots all the way around the outside edge. Now I'm going to start to go up under it. So keep in mind, there are plants that have tap roots. A lot of times conifers, pecans, hickories, even butterfly weed. You might want to look this up to see how, if you need to go really, really deep digging this out. This one just has a wider spreading fibrous root system, so I don't need to dig, way down into the ground. But there are plants that do have tap roots. Let's see. Again, this thing's just going to pop right out of the ground. So now that I've got all the spreading roots kind of cut on it, so I'm just going to go under, keep lifting up on it like this until I'm pretty sure that it's completely broken free. Of course, I have ligustrum seedlings everywhere in this landscape. There's so many of them in the neighborhood. Constantly digging them out. So from here, I'm just going to go under it, lift back on it, and I don't even think this thing's put on a whole lot of roots since it's been in the ground. Use your shovel underneath it. Might be helpful to have two people with shovels underneath it, even a flat shovel underneath it, and get your tarp as close as you can to it. And again, this is a very small plant, so easy peasy. Moving it onto there so we lose as little as possible of the soil. There we go. I'm going to drag this over to where it goes. It's just easy to drag it on a tarp if you've got space to do it. This is a very small plant, so this isn't a great example. I've got an azalea to pull out in the front garden space that I'll show in another video that'll be a much bigger root ball on it. But again, this is the best way to do it. Disturbs the roots the least amount. So know where the plant's going when you pull it out of the ground. We don't want it out of the ground for very long. It's a cold morning, cold, cloudy, cool morning this morning, so it's unlikely it's going to do any damage to it. I mean, it's above freezing, but certainly on a, we don't want sun on those roots. We want to keep the air off of them, as much as possible. It could just go in a container. If I needed a few days to prep another spot, it could go in a container, or I could dig a small hole somewhere and just set it on that and then pile leaves up around it for a few days. That would work. If you're in the middle of a project and you got to pull things out and you got to store them, that's another way to go about that. I've got a hardwood mulch in here, and I do pull it back. I don't like to mix a lot of that just heavy wood in there. I don't mind bark going in the planting hole, but the actual chunks of wood I don't want in there. I'm going to dig a wide hole, but I'm not going to dig a super deep hole. Really no reason to, unless, again, you brought a plant over that had a taproot and you had intentionally dug deeper. The deeper I go, the more likely it is I won't get that soil packed down very well and my plant will sink. And so I want this back in the ground, slightly elevated above the grade, and the soil compacted enough that it doesn't sink afterwards. I think this is a problem a lot of people have, is they don't backfill the soil very well, and then they end up with plants sinking. And the other thing is, make sure you're moving your plant to the appropriate place. Hopefully it's, if it's a sun plant, it's moving to a sun area. If it's a shade plant, it's moving to, make sure you're not moving it to a place that's even worse than where you had it for whatever reason you're having to move it. But this is the spot along the edge of this path that I'm going to put this one, and again, I can make quick work of digging in this soil. I do have irrigation, drip irrigation over here, and so it's right there. I think you can see that, and we will try to avoid cutting that. I ran the pipes about 18 inches apart, and so there's another one somewhere right up here. So I'm careful trying to find those as I go. If you've got a bed that's really, looking great, new, fresh mulch, that kind of thing, you might want to put another tarp over here to the side and pile this soil onto it, and so it doesn't make a giant mess out of your bed. It's a bit more gravelly in this section. I think maybe somebody at some point had some gravel out here. All of these old houses had oil drums, and so this may have been the spot where the oil drum had been, before it was pulled out. Okay. Okay, so I think we can measure using the shovel the depth versus the depth of the root ball over here and get that get that right. And then again, I'm going wider than the root ball. I actually think I'm a little bit deep here. And so I'm going to put a little bit of that soil back. When you put that soil back, this is the opportunity for this plant to sink. So tamp this down a bit. Not some, not like you're, tamping for a brick sidewalk or something, but just, gently tamp it down. Leave some air in it though. And that way this plant, doesn't like get sucked into the ground later. Again, you can use shovel, 2 shovels. Somebody can pick up on one corner if you need to, if it's a big giant root ball. This is a very underwhelming transplant job by Jim. This is such a small plant. Again, we've got it wide enough for all these roots to be in there. One thing I'm going to do, and I'll show you this, and I've shown this on every planting video I've ever done. Use your shovel and lay it across the planting hole. Let's get down to the actual soil right there. Okay, so if we lay this across here, I want the crown of this plant. Let's uncover some more of these leaves so you can see this. I need the crown of this plant to be higher than the edges. And so using this shovel, I know that I want to come up just a bit more with this Weigela. So I'm a little lower than I want to be. Some of these plants are so heavy that, not this one. This one will be easy for me to take out and put back in. But a lot of times you might have transplanted something that's so heavy that you can't pull it back out. And so what I'll do is I'll take some of this soil from the edge like this, and I'll basically just lift up on the plant and start to tuck some of this under it. Just one side and then the other if we need to elevate it some, but that's how I'll go about that. Trying to tamp it down in there, and tamp it down. Don't get all the air. Don't remove all the air, but most of the settling needs to be done by your foot. And I think that's going to be it. I think that's definitely, now the crown of the plant from where I moved it is, so the bottom of the shovel is the grade. The top of the shovel is about that much higher, if that makes sense, just the thickness of that shovel, and that's where my crown is even with the top of that shovel. So perfect. And we're just going to come around, use this soil we pulled out of the hole. Again, it would have made sense for me to actually just have that soil on a tarp or something over there. We don't want to cover anything that wasn't covered from the top of this root ball. None of this. We don't want to see any of the soil climbing up on this plant. Okay, and I'm just going to go around here and tamp this gently. Unfortunately, I said it's easier to dig when it's wet. It's also easier to over-compact things when it's wet as well. So this is the point to water it in. So if we water it in some, that will probably settle the soil just a bit more, and then we can use a bit of what's left over here to make up that space where it's settled. The rest of this soil, there's a little bit of leftover soil here, 2 or 3 shovelfuls, and we have a giant hole on the other side of the landscape over there, and I'll just throw this little bit of extra onto my tarp, drag it back over to the hole that this came out of, and that'll be that. Let me see. And from here, I'm going to remulch this space and just make it look a bit better. I've got some. I actually have a bucket with some mulch in it over here that was extra, and I'll spread this out around it, super thin near the plant. Again, don't want to bury this plant too much. So this is pulling it away again. Okay, so this is best done when it's dormant. I would have cut this back if it had been an evergreen plant or it was a much larger plant and I was going to be doing more damage to the roots. You can tie them up to help you move them, and Best done this time of year. Like I said, it's pretty straightforward. I've got an azalea in the front garden. It's much more established than this, and I'm actually going to move it to a container so that I can give it away to a neighbor, and that'll be in an upcoming video. If you want to see a much larger plant transplanted, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Thanks for watching.